Hi everyone, welcome to our video on pulse width modulation. We're going to talk about what is pulse width modulation, why do we want to use it, and how does it work. So we'll go over a couple of review items, but before we get into the review items, one thing that we should talk about is analog signals. So this has to do with the previous video that we've had on analog signals, and we know that we can read in analog signals, and we can use an analog to digital converter to do that. But with pulse width modulation, we're trying to figure out a way to send out an analog signal. So something you might notice if you look at an Arduino is you have a lot of digital pins, and then you also have some analog input pins. So your digital pins can send out or receive digital signals, so high or low, 1 or 0. But they can't really send out a range between 0 and 5 volts. It's either all 0 volts or all 5 volts. And then your analog pins are really only meant to read in, or they're by default set to read in an analog signal, which is something between 0 and 5 volts. And we can actually read that, and we have a couple of different steps, so actually 1,024 different layers of voltage that we can read. And we'll review that here in just a second, but we want to figure out a way to send out an analog signal, and that's what pulse width modulation is going to do for us. So first we're going to review analog inputs really quickly. Then we're going to talk about GPIO pins and what they are. And if you've been following along, we've already covered GPIO pins, but we haven't been calling them GPIO pins. We're also going to talk then about pulse width modulation, and then we're going to conclude with a little bit of information on like processing speed and just kind of a review of technology. So first, let's look at analog inputs. If you just watched the last video, this will be familiar to you. Analog inputs are analog pins on the Arduino. We have an Arduino analog to digital converter. We have 10-bit resolution on that analog to digital converter, which means we have 2 to the 10th or 1,024 different voltage levels between 0 and 5 volts that we can read. So we have over here a bunch of levels, and I could draw 1,024 lines here. And we could read those voltages. And that's kind of our resolution there. 10-bit resolution means we have 1,024 steps between our 5 volts and our ground. So yeah, let's talk about the analog pins. What are these analog pins and how can we use them? Well, you'll see over here, general purpose input-output pins. Analog pins, believe it or not, can be used as digital inputs or digital outputs. They are by default set as analog inputs, reading some range of values between 0 and 5, but you can easily just say, I just want this to act as a digital pin. I just want it to say, yes, it's 5 volts, or no, it's 0 volts. You can also just send out a full 5 volts or 0 volts. So yeah, you can use these as a digital input or digital output. You can also read in actual analog signals. So a signal that is somewhere between 0 and 5 volts. And I should also mention for Arduinos, again, we're using 0 to 5 volt logic. This changes depending on the board that you're using. A lot of things are going to 0 to 3.3 volt logic because then we're using less power that way, a little bit more efficient. But yeah, for our Arduinos right now, 0 to 5 volts with a resolution of 10 bits. So 0 to 1023 for 0 to 5 volts. If you use a 10-bit resolution for something 0 to 3 volts, then that changes the size of each of those steps. But for right now, just understand 0 to 5 volts is what we're working with, and 1,023 steps. Cool. Digital pins. So we have a bunch of digital pins on our Arduino. These are GPIO, again, general purpose input-output pins. You see up here, general purpose input-output. And that means that they can be digital inputs and they can be digital outputs. That means they're trying to read whether it's a 5 or a 0 and saying, yes, I'm getting in something that's 0 volts or 5 volts. They can also send out 0 volts or 5 volts. And we don't have any analog input or output on these. with a little asterisk there. They don't have an analog output unless you see that little tilde symbol. And it's not a true analog output. It's not actually a voltage between 0 and 5 volts. But we can kind of fake it using pulse width modulation. So the tilde means that a pin is pulse width modulated. And the tilde is really just kind of representing a sine wave or something. But it's just a tilde. And that is telling us that it's not just on or off. That we can kind of, at this point, we can kind of fake a voltage somewhere between 0 and 5 volts. So a couple of things that we need to talk about here. Pulse width modulation. Well, what do each of these mean? Well, a pulse is a certain period of time where our data signal is high at 5 volts. And width is, well, how long is it high? And modulation means that we can change how long this little pulse of voltage is high versus how long it's low. And for an entire duty cycle, which we will talk about in a second, we run 490 duty cycles per second, 490 hertz. So around 500 hertz, so 500 times per second, we are modulating this voltage on to off. And a little secret here, on our Arduinos, pins 5 and 6 actually run at 980 hertz, so twice as fast. So yeah, that can definitely be useful in a couple of situations. But yeah, so what is a duty cycle in the first place? Well, a duty cycle is how long the pin is high versus low, or over a, in this case, 0.002 second period. So if we're running at 490 hertz, well, what is 1 divided by 490? Right around 0.002 seconds per cycle. And that's our duty cycle. So if you see right here, I have a little area that goes from 0 to 0.002. That is 1 duty cycle, and it takes 2 1,000ths of a second. And we have a voltage in there, and that voltage about half the time is up at 5 volts. So up here, we're at 5 volts for about half of this total 0.002 seconds. And then the other half, we're down here at the 0 volt range. And so that means that we have a 50% duty cycle. If we're on for half the time and off for half the time, we have a 50% duty cycle. So I'm going to write over here 50%. And we can kind of look at this and say, well, over the course of all of this, what is our average voltage? Well, if we have 0 volts at the bottom and we have 5 volts up at the top, and we are averaging out 50% between those two, well, then we have 2.5 volts average. So our average voltage across this is 2.5 volts. So we've already can see here that we're using digital signals on or off to kind of fake some signal between a full 5 volt and a 0 volt signal. Let's move on to another little example here. So this one, we have 5 volts and 0 volts, same scale. But for this amount, for this one, we have this on for about, I don't know, 3/4 of the time, 3/4 of our duty cycle. And then the other 1/4, we have it off. So for 1/4 of the duty cycle, we have it off. Well, how long do we have it on? 75% of this duty cycle we have it on. So our duty cycle here is 75%. And what is our average voltage? Well, it's 75% of our full scale voltage, or our 5 volts. So 75% of 5 volts, I believe, is 3.75 volts. And that is our full scale voltage versus our duty cycle. So 75% of the time it's on, and then the other 1/4 of the time it's off. So 75% of 5 volts, 3.75. So we're again faking this 3.75 volts here. So we're essentially saying, I can only tell you 0 volts or 5 volts. But if we look at it over time, over this duty cycle, and we look at the average over our duty cycle, then we get an average of 3.75 volts instead of a full on or off. Last example here. So while we have it on for about 1/4 of the time, and then we have it off for the other 3/4 of the time over an entire duty cycle. And we're looking at this pulse width here. That's what we're changing every time. So you can see we have a thin pulse width right here. And this pulse width, if you've been paying attention, is about a 25% duty cycle. And that means 25% of 5 volts, or our full scale voltage, about 1.25 volts. So this is a pulse width modulation that is telling us that we are trying to emulate 1.25 volts on average across this duty cycle. And you can see that blue line there. So all of these blue lines are representing our average voltage. So you can see that we can change this pulse width. And the question here is, how small can we make our pulse width? So what is the resolution of this duty cycle? So like how small could we make one of these chunks here? Could we make it 1/8 and cut this in half? Could we make it 1/16? Like 1/32? Like how small can we get this? The answer is we have 8 bits, essentially. We have 256 potential values that we can hit. 0 counts as a value, so if 0 counts as a value and we have 256 total, then our scale goes from 0 to 255 on an Arduino. And so 256 little chunks that we can potentially hit here. And this is an actual representation here of all of those chunks. So every single column that you can see here on this grid is a potential setting that you could send to your pulse width modulation. And we're going to pull this up to full scale. This is actually about 10% duty cycle, 26 out of 255. So this is how many chunks you have to choose from. 255 chunks if you include 0, or if you don't include 0. So yeah, you can see we have a lot of possibility here. So our average voltage on this 10% duty cycle, well, it's 10% of 5 volts. So this little average bar down here is somewhere around 0.5 volts. This is a 10% duty cycle. So this whole thing, this entire duty cycle, all of these readings, every single column in here, we can read one of these columns 256 times over the course of 0.002 seconds. So 2 1,000ths of a second is how long it takes to read all of these little pulses and see which ones are high versus which ones are low, and then kind of calculate, what's our percentage here. And so that means that if we're looking at each of these little divisions, and I'm just calling each one of these columns a division here for this case, that means we're looking at around 7.5 microseconds per division. So that is 0.0000754 microseconds, or 754 seconds, pardon me, is how long it takes to read each one of these little columns. That's insanely fast. So our microcontroller, our Arduino, runs at 16 megahertz, which means that we can do 16 million bit manipulations, so changing a 1 or a 0 every second. And that just happens to be our processor speed for the Arduino. So we can change 1 bit every 0.00000000625 seconds, every 62.5 nanoseconds. It's really, really fast. The thing is, technology has come a really long way And this is not one of the fastest things out here. So we can talk about a new microcontroller that's kind of recently come out here, and that is called the Raspberry Pi Pico. Very similar to an Arduino in some respects, very different in others. This one runs at 133 megahertz. If you remember, the Arduino runs at just 16 megahertz. So this one runs at 133 million bit manipulations per second. So it's 8.3 times faster than our Arduino that we're using right now. And this brings up a point that I want to talk about here for a second, and then we'll move on and we'll be done with this video. And that is that technology is increasing at a really rapid rate. So 16 megahertz, 16 million bit manipulations per second was unheard of, say, like 50 years ago. And now we have things that run 133 million manipulations per second, which is 8.5 or just about 8.5 times faster than our Arduino, and it just costs $4. So an Arduino is going to cost you about $20, and that has a little bit to do with marketing. But this one, the Raspberry Pi Pico, costs about $4. You get insane processing power for $4. You can do that many processes per second, and this brings up the point that as technology progresses, generally the cost of technology decreases. We find more efficient ways to manufacture things. We can use computers to make our computers better. We don't have to rely on handwritten math anymore, and as we improve computers make it easier to improve other computers. So there are lots of advancements that we are coming to with this. But that's just a little aside there at the end. Hopefully this has been a good informational video on pulse width modulation and why it's valuable. One thing I should mention again, if you need a real analog signal. So this, generally we just can read this into anything that takes in pulse width modulated signals, and it's going to see a high voltage and a low voltage, and it's going to say, okay, this is telling me that it's a voltage of, in this case, 0.5 volts, but it's not actually that. If you needed a real analog output, then you would need something that is like a digital to analog converter, and those are on different boards. There are absolutely boards that have those on them. We just don't have one on our Arduino that we can access here. So yeah, if you have any questions, please send me those questions. I am happy to go over this with you and talk about pulse width modulation and potential projects that you can do with it, and a little bit more of why it's useful. Thanks for watching. I almost forgot to mention, actually, we have a cool little thing here that I can show you, and this is an oscilloscope that I have hooked up. It's called the N-scope. It's a little cheap oscilloscope, and you can see here I have this sketch running, and all this Arduino sketch is doing is it is analog writing to pin 6, 255 over 2. So our full 255 value over 2. And you can see here that this is about what our duty cycle is here. So all of these divisions. And that means that about half the time it's on and half the time it's off. So you can see 50% duty cycle. So 255 over 2. If 255 is our full range of values, and that encompasses one duty cycle, and we say, okay, we want whatever that is over 2, then we're going to take 50% of that, right? 1/2 of our duty cycle is going to be on, and the other half is going to be off. So if I change this to 3, then we're going to say that 1/3 of our duty cycle is going to be on, and the other 2/3 are going to be off, and that should be reflected here. So you can see that just changed here. 1/3 is on, the other 2/3 is off. And we can change this up to 255 times. So if we did, say, 254, that might actually be so small that we might not even be able to register it on this oscilloscope. Maybe? Oh yeah, we can. Okay, so you can see there's this tiny little division here, one little chunk, and then the rest of it is off. So really, really small fraction there. let's say we did 255 over 1. So that's a full duty cycle. What is that going to look like? Well, it should just show us a straight 5-volt line here. So we'll wait for this to upload. It looks like it did upload. Might be having some triggering issues here. Yep, so I actually am having some trigger issues because I can't trigger it anymore. It's just a straight 5-volt line. So let me turn this off. Yep, so now we just see a straight line. It's 5 volts sitting right up here at around our 5-volt range. So if I do a full duty cycle like that, and we're just going to have a straight line at 5 volts. If I cut my duty cycle into, say, fourths, and then I run this, then a quarter of the time it's going to be on and a quarter of the time it's going to be off. We have 255 potential settings for this. So a quarter of the time it's on, the other 3 quarters it's off. That is our 1/4 duty cycle. Now, I have another cool little thing here that I can show you. So we're going to comment this line out, and we're going to uncomment this set of for loops here. And this is, all this does is for the first loop, it writes to this, or it writes our pin actually to some value between 0 and 255. And it moves from 0 all the way up to 255 for this pulse width modulation. And then moves from our full 255 for our full duty cycle back down to 0. And we can upload this, and then we can see this kind of move across, and we can watch it grow and shrink. So you can see now our duty cycle is growing up towards 255, and then we hit it, boop, and then we come all the way back down, and then we eventually hit 0. And so this is all of our settings for our duty cycle. And you can see how this is kind of faking a voltage here. So maybe I can use this little trigger thing here. We would be at like half a voltage there, and then we would get all the way up to like 5 volts, go back down, and this is our kind of our average voltage line. But yeah, that is pulse width modulation in action. So we're just kind of monitoring what that pulse width modulation looks like off of our PWM pin, which happens to be pin 6. Thanks for watching.